Chapter 11. Seated behind the desk in his office, Nick held the telephone receiver to his ear. He'd left the door open when he came in to make the phone call, and now he mindlessly watched Bethany and Diane ready the dining room for the lunch crowd that'd be pouring in as soon as the doors opened at 11. Nick checked his watch. 10:15. Once he got Tony over at Molina's bakery on the phone, there was no use talking to anybody else. Tony owned the place and was the only one who could definitively give him a yes. Nick started with a casual, "Morning, Tony. It's Nick Matthews." He could damn near hear Tony tensing up across the airwaves. Uh-oh. Was he going to get all weird about the wedding that didn't happen? Tony said to him, "Nick, I've been meaning to give you a call." "But you thought it might turn out awkward, right?" Nick chuckled to himself. "There's just never enough hours in the day, are there?" Nick gave him an out, hoping he'd take it. "Not when you're the bearer of bad news." Tony's voice tightened. "Bad news?" Nick stiffened, straightened in his chair. Did Tony think Nick didn't know he'd been stood up at the altar? He couldn't possibly know about the banking issues, could he? "Well, I've had plenty of that lately, Tony. And I hate to make things worse for you." "Worse? How could things possibly get worse?" "But you have a job to do." Nick felt a burning itch prickling at his gut. He could, and probably should, let Tony keep tiptoeing around his point, but Nick said it anyway. "So why don't you just tell me what you've been beating around the bush about?" Tony cleared his throat. "Nick, your account with us hasn't been paid in nearly 6 months." "What?" Nick bellowed. "Jeannie kept coming up with excuse after excuse, mostly to do with how she'd been so busy because of the wedding. Each time we talked, she'd promised to get it in the mail, but if she did, we never received it." Tony's voice remained shaky, but he kept talking. "I kept excusing it because of your reputation, but quite honestly, Nick, we can't extend any more credit or supplies to you until your account is paid in full." "Look, Tony, I'll be straight with you." Nick sucked in a breath, hating to admit, say it out loud, what Ginny had done. But what else was he supposed to do? Tony Molina wanted his money. He expected it and had every right to it. Trouble was, Nick didn't have it to give. He had to buy a little more time. "Between you and me, Ginny did more damage than just leaving me at the altar. She cleaned me out." There was a silence between them that went on for so long that Nick thought the call might have been dropped. But finally, Tony said in a less than agreeable tone, "I see." More silence. Then he cleared his throat again. "How are you set for supplies?" Tony knew as well as Nick that without supplies the restaurant would close right away, and without the restaurant Nick didn't stand a chance at coming out of this intact. "A couple of days. You know, the fresh foods come in almost daily." "I wish I could help." But Tony's voice was so fixed that Nick knew he wouldn't be getting any more credit from Molina's bakery. Still, he had to try. "But without your breads, I can't run the restaurant. Without the restaurant, I don't stand a chance at squaring these debts." Debts that Nick owed because of Ginny. It was a good thing he didn't know where she was. If he did, he just might kill her. "I'm sorry. I can't give you any more credit." "What if I can pay for the new order?" "We're going to need some form of payment on the unpaid balance, too." Tony paused. "You might want to consider a mortgage on the restaurant to tide you over." Nick nodded. Hang Ten is already mortgaged. Nick had already thought about that, but in light of his current financial problem, nobody was going to give him a mortgage on the restaurant. The likelihood of Nick coming out of this on top was not good. "I'm going to go out on a limb here for you, Nick." Tony said it like he was doing him a tremendous favor. And he was. The problem with that was people like Tony Molina always expected something in return for their favors. "You send your order over tomorrow, along with a 10% payment on the balance, and I'll cover you." 10%? Nick did a quick tally in his head. If he took money from the last few days' revenue, he might be able to swing it. Ever since he found out what Ginny had done, he'd been keeping the restaurant's money in his office safe. He couldn't put it in the bank. They'd end up taking it to satisfy his debt. And right now they were at the bottom of his priority list. The restaurant had to be at the top. Without it, all the rest would die, including the community center. After several more phone calls, all to suppliers, and all with the same end result as Molina's Bakery, Nick was able to finally hang up the phone and breathe a sigh of relief, if for nothing other than not having to face another call. At least not today. All he had to do was triple his customer base for the next month, and he might be able to dig his head out enough to catch a breath. But that wasn't likely to happen. Nick pushed himself up from the desk. Inwardly, he felt himself sinking further and further down into the abyss. He strolled around to the front of the desk and leaned against it. This financial crisis had wrapped itself menacingly around him. He felt it sucking the air from his lungs and tightening the noose around his throat. Jenny. How in the world had he been so blinded by her? How did he not see what she was up to? Carelessness, that's how. His carelessness was going to teach him a very tough lesson. He'd trusted Jenny. Hell, he thought he was going to marry her. Look where that got him. Nick grabbed the chair sitting by the door and slammed it against the door frame. It splintered into pieces. The seat landed in the doorway, and he kicked it into the dining room. Bethany, who was putting the finishing touches on the tables, looked up. Uncertainty drained her face of all color. "Nick?" She barely got the word out. "What's wrong?" "I'm a stupid ass, that's what's wrong." He slammed the door shut and glared around the office, considering his next move. Demolishing the chair felt good, but fleeting. Maybe if he broke something else. He latched onto the coffee table sitting halfway between the door and his desk. Just as he picked it up, there was a loud knock on the door. "Nick!" Dean bellowed through the wall. Holding the table in midair, Nick looked at the door. The words, "Go away," flittered through his mind, but never made it past his lips. "Nick!" Dean's voice was more forceful this time. The door opened. Nick gave a disgruntled sigh and set the table back down on the floor. "What?" he said, looking back at Dean. "What the hell are you doing?" Dean came inside the office. "Breaking shit." "Why?" "It feels good." "You're scaring the hell out of your staff." Guilt fogged Nick's brain. He never meant to scare his employees. "I'm sorry about that." "Apologize to them, not me." "I will." Nick raked his hand through his hair. It felt long, nearly to his collar now. He needed a haircut. He looked around the office, then slumped down onto the coffee table. "I feel like I'm drowning." "What's going on?" Dean stepped toward Nick, but remained standing over him. "Things didn't go as well as you hoped with your suppliers?" "No." Nick avoided looking at Dean. "Turns out I'm 4 to 6 months behind with everyone who supplies anything to hang 10. At that moment, he let his gaze travel up to meet Dean's. Dean dragged the chair near the door across the floor and sat down in front of Nick. "Okay, seriously, man. Is there any other area of your life that Jenny could have screwed you out of money?" Nick laughed and took a moment to think about it. Sadly, though, Jenny had cleaned him out of every cent she could get her hands on. This well has officially run dry. Nick could see it in Dean's eyes. His mind was frantically probing for a solution that had put Nick on top. He hated to tell his friend that it was a futile search. Finally, Dean said, "Maybe you could sue her for breach of promise." Nick's laughter snorted out even though he'd tried to contain it. "Will that get me $250,000?" he said with light sarcasm. "Because that's about what I'll need to get out of the hole Jenny's dug me into." $250,000? Dean's voice went weak. "That much, huh?" "Damn near it." And they both knew it might as well be $1 million because Nick didn't have access to either. "Times like this make you wish you had a rich relative stashed away somewhere." A rich relative? Well, Nick didn't have that, but he did have the next best thing. He didn't know why he hadn't thought of it before. Walter. Dean looked him straight in the eye. "Walter's dead." "Yes," Nick stood, "but his foundation is alive and kicking." He moved toward the office door and closed it. "They know I was in his will. Maybe they will give me a low-interest loan." For the first time in days, Nick felt a spark of hope. "Could be worth a shot." "You'd better hope so." "Me?" Dean laid his hand on his chest. "If I don't fix this mess soon," he said, "I'll lose the restaurant." He hated to be so blunt, but there it was. The new owners might not be so inclined to continue funding the community center. Dean's face went pale. Obviously, he hadn't thought about the repercussions of Nick's predicament as it trickled down to the community center. Until now. Now, Dean was finally seeing that Nick's losing Hang Ten would be a disaster on more than one level. Of course, the restaurant would live on, but it would belong to someone else. Nick would be homeless, and he and Dean would both be jobless. But the thing that stabbed at Nick the most was that the community center, the legacy to his brother's memory, would wither away. Chapter 12. Lacey knew they were coming. Even so, seeing Camille and Tasha and the kids with their nanny, Velma, standing in her living room with Soren's brother, Gerard, turned out to be a bit overwhelming. This was starting to feel a lot like an intervention. "Just breathe," Lacey coached herself. "And remember, this is your house." If she could keep that thought in her head, she'd be okay. She was the boss here, not Gerard, not Camille or Tasha, although neither of her sisters-in-law had ever tried to boss her around. Lacey hoped today was not the day they started. Gerard looked a little like Soren. Same light brown hair, same pale blue eyes, same stature, similar facial features. The biggest difference was that Gerard was a little taller than Soren. "Gerard," Lacey offered her hand. He shook it. "It's been a long time. Do you remember me?" "Yes, ma'am," he nodded subserviently. "It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance again, ma'am." She clasped her own hands together at her midriff and gave him a hard stare. "Rule number 1, we have to dispense with the formalities," she said with a hint of shaky laughter. "Ma'am?" Gerard grimaced. "For starters," she said, "just call me Lacey." "Good luck with that," Tasha chuckled. She'd been trying for 2 years to get her staff to call her Tasha. The best she'd ever gotten for her efforts was Miss Tasha. "If you say so, ma'am." Gerard nodded and backed up a step or two. "Come on, Gerard." Deidre waved at him. "I'll show you where your room is." Gerard glanced around at the other women, and when none of them objected, he followed Deidre out of the living room. Lacey looked at Camille and Tasha. "Shall we sit?" She motioned toward the couch and chairs. Her sisters-in-law nodded and moved to the couch. Lacey chose the chair to their right. "I'm thrilled to see both of you." She offered up what she hoped was a friendly smile and peered down at her niece and nephew, who were hanging onto their mother's legs, looking up at Lacey shyly. She gave them a big smile and stretched out her arms, saying, "Juliana, James, come give Aunt Lacey a hug." Both children giggled and ran to Lacey, climbing onto her lap. After a moment or two, Camille looked at the nanny, saying, "Velma, would you take the kids outside?" With an obedient smile, Velma headed for the sliding glass door, coaxing the children to follow. Within seconds, all three were outside and out of earshot. Camille looked at Lacey with a quick, pressing nod. Looked like she was here on a mission, probably Julian's mission, and she'd brought Tasha along for support. They all, the entire family, thought Lacey, was too naive. And maybe that was true, but she had news for them. She was far from stupid. "So, what is it that my brothers have sent you here to tell me?" Camille and Tasha glanced at each other knowingly, then smiled an appreciative sort of smile that you see on mothers when their child takes their first step or says their first word. That was one of the reasons Lacey liked them both so much. They'd always treated her as an adult. something her parents and brothers were reluctant to do. Camille snickered and lowered her head. "You're much quicker than your father or brothers give you credit for." "Mama, too," Lacey wouldn't let them forget. "She still thinks I'm a child." "She does give you far more leeway than the men do," Tasha put in. "And you two are exceptionally gifted in the art of diversion." Lacey deliberately raised her eyebrows and took extra care to keep her face stoic, serious. "But that doesn't change anything. I still want to know why my brothers sent you." Camille spoke up. "Well, not just your brothers, Claudette too." She drew a breath and eased it out in a long sigh. "I'll just cut to the chase and tell you that Maurice is up to his old tricks." One thing Lacey knew, Camille was well versed in Papa's old tricks. He'd done his best to see that she didn't stay married to Julian. Fat lot of good it had done him. Same with Tasha and Andre, except Papa hadn't been against their marriage, but had in fact orchestrated it. He'd been so fixated on making sure Andre married Tasha that he hadn't realized he'd given Lacey pure freedom in the process, until it was too late. Lacey was glad her father had been devious enough to know that if she were included in Edouard Renault's will, Andre would never risk losing the inheritance. He would do whatever it took to make sure Lacey got it, and he had. Papa just hadn't thought far enough ahead to see that her independence would also come hand in hand with that inheritance. It was a tough lesson, and everybody knew that Papa had it coming. But if Lacey knew her brothers, they envied her for being the teacher. Lacey couldn't help laughing out loud. "Lacey," Tasha said, "this is not at all funny. Your father wants you to come home, and we all know Maurice gets what he wants." "What's he going to do?" she asked, enjoying this a little too much. But they just sat there with these flat expressions. Lacey added with a shrug, "Cut me off?" "You underestimate your father." Camille's tone was loaded with warning, and she meant well, but Lacey was going to show them all that she could get down in the dirt and scrap with the best of them, just as soon as she figured out how. "And he underestimates me." Lacey pumped her words with confidence. Yes, he does," Camille said. "And your mother sees that. She's very afraid that he's going to push you into doing something reckless." Truth be told, Camille looked a little worried about that too. "And we're here to implore you not to lose your cool and do something you'll regret." "Trust me." Lacey leaned in closer. "Whatever I choose to do to fight Papa, I won't be the one with regrets." "We hope for your sake that is the case," Tasha said. "You should be prepared, though." Camille's steady nod supported her words. "Maurice intends to have you deported. Claudette has bought you a little time by sending Gerard over, but it's only a matter of time. Sooner rather than later, I suspect you will be forced to leave the United States." "But I own property here." "You wouldn't be the first property owner to get kicked out of this country," Tasha said. "Or the last," Lacey laughed nervously. "Don't worry. I'll think of something to avoid it." "We all know there's only one way to get out of being deported." Tasha put it out there. Lacey giggled. "My brothers would be shocked to hear you suggest such a thing." "Whose idea do you think it is?" Camille looked Lacey straight in the eye. "Not my brothers." Lacey's gaze ping-ponged between the two of them, waiting for them to crack a smile and say it was a joke. They didn't. She began shaking her head. "They would not seriously suggest that I marry someone just so I can stay in the country." "You underestimate your brothers," Camille chuckled. "Julian knows you're just as capable of fighting fire with fire as he or Andre, maybe more so." Camille's undertone was unmistakable. "Which is why I'm supposed to tell you that Julian has already contacted Davis to draw up the contracts. When you've chosen a groom, he'll personalize the agreement. None of us wants to see you lose half your inheritance to some unscrupulous parasite while trying to buy a little more time." "Can I trust this Davis?" Lacey couldn't help but wonder, although she'd always trusted Julian and Andre. She thought she could trust Camille and Tasha. Surely they wouldn't allow themselves to become Papa's lackeys. Camille nodded with certainty. He's Julian's legal advisor here in the States. He's never met your father. If you want to avoid being deported, Tasha said, you should start looking into that promptly. Lacey dragged her hands through her hair, held it back, then released it. Did you two come here to help me pick out a husband? Camille and Tasha's laughter bellowed out. Camille, whom they all knew spoke for Julian in this case, said, We are only here to make sure that you come out of this with as little inconvenience to you as possible. The notion that Papa might interfere with Lacey's good time in the States had been bothering her since the last time she'd spoken to Mama. Even so, Lacey hadn't really considered that Papa could be serious. Until now. Thanks to her brothers and their wives. But Lacey was going to outmaneuver Papa in true de Laurent fashion. Again, thanks to her brothers and their wives. Lacey was going to find herself a husband. Just not a real one. This marriage was going to be one that would expire in, say, 6 months. Bring on, Papa! Lacey could handle anything he threw at her now, because she had a fix. The next morning, when Lacey entered the kitchen, Gerard was already in there, standing at the counter, scribbling on a tablet. She cleared her throat, and his eyes lifted to meet hers. Good morning, madam, he said, and went back to his scribbling. Good morning, Gerard. She opened the refrigerator and grabbed the orange juice. I trust you slept well? Very well, madam, thank you. She plucked a glass from a cabinet near the counter. Now, we talked about this, she said in a light scolding tone. My name is Lacey. Yes, we did. He paused. Miss Lacey. If Gerard was anything like Soren or the other staff she'd encountered, that was about the best she could hope for in dispensing with the formalities. She poured herself a glass and put the juice back in the refrigerator. She peeked at the paper and asked, What are you doing there? Our first order of business is to hire a cook. Our? Lacey laughed. A cook? We don't need a cook. She shook her head. We usually eat cereal for breakfast. Sometimes Deidre jogs down to the pastry shop a few blocks away. It makes her feel like she's exercising those extra calories off before she even eats them. Lacey used a comical tone, hoping to get Gerard to lighten up, but it didn't work. For lunch and dinner, we either dine out or have something delivered. See? She shrugged. There's no need for a cook. Be that as it may. Gerard's eyes fell back to his list. Mrs. de Laurent thinks it's best if you have a cook at your disposal. Mrs. de Laurent? Lacey wanted clarification on which Mrs. he was speaking of. He said, Your mother. Lacey snorted. Papa probably told you to say that. Gerard's eyes remained stuck on the notepad. Your parents only want what is best for you, madam. He cleared his throat and corrected himself. Miss Lacey. Yeah. Lacey laughed to herself. Well, she'd better start looking for a husband, quickly, especially now that Papa had managed to plant his very own spy inside her house. Chapter 13. The sun peeked over the Santa Monica Mountains, and why shouldn't it? Today was going to be a beautiful day. With the help of Walter's foundation, Nick would begin to dig himself out of debt today. He hurried toward the entrance of the 10-story building, and the glass doors swished open, wafting cool air over him. He stepped inside, happy to get out of the morning heat. Inside the lobby, Nick headed for the elevators. A handful of people were already waiting, and the up button was already lit. Nick joined those waiting, offering smiles to the ones who looked him in the eye. Finally, the doors slid open. Nick slipped inside with the crowd and punched number 8 on the panel. As the lift moved upward, the compartment began to fill with office politics chatter. Someone, a woman behind him, was pissed off about being passed over for that no-good scoundrel down in advertising. Nick supposed this sort of thing went on at Hang Ten in the employee lounge behind the supply room. He chuckled softly, wondering if the same kind of backstabbing went on between the waitresses and bus people. The doors parted on floor 8, Nick's stop. He stepped off the elevator and headed down the hallway to the left. He knew where to find Phil's office. He needed no direction. Nick was still feeling good, although a bit anxious by the time he opened the door. Phil's secretary greeted him with a smile. She was new. Approaching her desk, he cut his eyes stealthily to her nameplate, Janine, and then gave her a big smile. "Good morning, Janine. I'm Nick Matthews. I'm here to see Phil." The whole time he'd been talking, she'd been giving him an obvious look-over. Based on the smile tipping the corners of her mouth, she liked what she saw. "Mr. Matthews," she said, standing. "He's expecting you." She led him to the door on the far wall, gave it a quick double knock before opening it, and said to Phil, "Nick Matthews is here." "Come on in, Nick," Phil's voice echoed into the outer office. Janine stepped aside and waited for Nick to go in. When he did, she closed the door between them. "Nick!" Phil stood and moved around the desk, extending his hand. "How's the restaurant? How's Jenny?" Nick sucked in a breath for courage as they shook hands. It's not that he was nervous about his chances, he just didn't know where to begin. And truth be told, it was a little ego-bruising to admit to anyone what Jenny had done to him. Nevertheless, Walter's foundation was his only hope. "Well," Nick said as Phil went back to the chair behind his desk, "the restaurant is fine." Nick took one of the 2 chairs in front of the desk. "Jenny? Well, that's what I came to talk to you about." "Oh?" Phil gave him a concerned look. Nick hoped it was genuine rather than practiced. "So the rumors are true, then?" "Depends on what you're hearing," Nick said. "I'm hearing the wedding didn't happen." "That's true. Perhaps you'll reschedule in the future." Nick almost laughed. "That's not likely." It took him a few seconds, but finally he managed to say, "To be quite honest, Phil, Jenny took me to the cleaners." Phil listened intently while Nick detailed the particulars of every bad deed Jenny had perpetrated during her process of not only wiping Nick out financially, but also leaving him in deep debt. When Nick was done, he shrugged, sighed, then fell silent. It took Phil a second or two before he asked, behind a friendly smile, "How can we help?" Nick felt the burden practically lifting off his shoulders. He hadn't realized just how anxious he'd been. "I need a loan, Phil." Nick waited, feeling confident that Phil would say, "How much do you need?" But instead of asking how much, Phil said, "That's quite a debt you've incurred, Nick." "Yes?" Nick nodded, feeling his confidence getting ready to make a run for it. "But the restaurant is strong and solid. I could pay it back, I'm sure." He handed Phil the portfolio of Hang Ten's financial reports. "What about the banks?" Phil left Hang Ten's file on the desk, making no move to open it. "What do they say?" "Nothing positive." Nick shook his head. Truth was, he owed too much money, and none of the banks were willing to help Nick Matthews put himself deeper in debt. The silence lingered between them for what seemed like forever. All the while, Nick's confidence was taking a hard hit. Finally, Phil said, "Tell you what I'm going to do." He nodded and gave Nick a half-hearted smile. "Since Mr. Moreland was so fond of you, I'm going to take this to the board." He picked up Hang Ten's financial folder and tapped it on the desk a couple of times. "We're going to find a way to help you." Moments later, Nick left Phil's office, and by the time he was out of the building, he'd managed to regain a large chunk of his confidence. Everything was going to work out. The foundation would step in and help him when no one else would. Because of Walter, they wouldn't turn him down. Would they? Nick cast that nasty thought out of his head. Walter's foundation was going to help. It had to. If it didn't, Nick was sunk. Lacey couldn't believe she'd agreed to go to lunch at Hang Ten with Deidre, Camille, and Tasha. And if that wasn't enough, they'd insisted on going in the limo Camille and Tasha had hired for the duration of their visit. Velma and the kids would stay behind at the house. Gerard had ordered pizza for their lunch, and that had made the kids happy. "Guys," Lacey said in a hushed voice when they were no more than 2 blocks from the restaurant, "do you think it's prudent to roll up in front of Hang Ten in a limo?" "Why wouldn't it be?" Camille laughed. "I'm trying to keep a low profile," Lacey said. "Not anymore," Tasha said. "You're after a husband now." "I don't get it." Lacey shook her head. "I can't get used to the idea that Julian and Andre are okay with me marrying someone just so Papa can't have me deported. Your brothers are certain you'll do something shocking when Maurice pushes you into a corner." Of course, Camille probably meant stupid rather than shocking. "They'd much rather you do it on their terms." "Yeah, I know," Lacey almost laughed. "They want to make sure I don't lose my inheritance." Her gaze drifted to the window as the limo rolled up in front of Hang Ten. She wondered if Nick and Jenny had returned from their honeymoon. The thought left her feeling nauseated and a bit sullen. Tasha elbowed Lacey's side. "They have good food here, or what?" "That's not all they have," Deidre chuckled. "Do tell." Tasha got serious. The driver, whose name Lacey hadn't caught, opened the door, and Camille climbed out first, followed by Tasha, then Deidre, and finally Lacey. When Carrie, the hostess, saw Lacey and Deidre, she smiled. "Ladies, looks like you brought us some friends today." "Indeed we did," Deidre said. Carrie grabbed 4 menus and said, "I've got your favorite table ready for you." They followed her to the booth back in the corner near Nick's office, Lacey's favorite place to sit, because she could always catch glimpses of Nick as he was coming and going about the restaurant's business. As the party slid into the booth, Lacey and Deidre on one side and Camille and Tasha on the other, Carrie said, "Are we having lemon drop martinis today?" Lacey was about to object, thinking it might not make the best impression on her sisters-in-law, when Camille said, "Ooh, that sounds delicious." She nodded, looking at the others. "Am I right?" "We'll have 4, Lacey said. "I'll get those started for you," Carrie said. "Diane will be your server today. She'll bring your drinks right over." Lacey watched the hostess walk away and did a quick scan of the restaurant. She didn't see Nick, or Jenny for that matter, anywhere. She never saw much of Jenny this early in the day, but Nick was usually always here. Maybe they were still on their honeymoon. Lacey looked back at the table. Camille and Tasha were busy perusing the menu. She swept the dining room once more. Still no Nick, before settling her gaze on Deidre. "I don't think he's here," Deidre said. That pulled Camille and Tasha away from their menus. "Who's not here?" Camille asked. "The owners," Lacey put in, like it was no big deal. "They're probably off on their honeymoon still." "Ah, newlyweds." Tasha beamed at the prospect. "Yeah," Lacey said, dejected. She brightened up, though, when she saw Diane headed their way with a tray of lemon drop martinis. That was sure to distract Tasha from talking about the grandeurs of being a newlywed. The martinis came. Orders were placed. Another round of martinis. And everybody was feeling good. Tasha sipped her drink and gazed around the restaurant pensively. "I think you should conduct your interviews here." "Definitely." Camille raised her glass as if toasting. "What interviews?" Lacey asked. "Husband interviews," Tasha giggled. "Why would I conduct interviews?" Lacey peered at Tasha through narrowed eyes. "How else are you going to find a husband for hire?" Camille asked. "You can't seriously expect that to work out well," Lacey cringed. "Worked out fine for Julian," Tasha snickered. Deidre elbowed Lacey. By the time Lacey looked at her, Deidre was staring toward the front door with this mischievous grin spreading across her face. Lacey followed Deidre's gaze and saw Nick and his best friend Dean heading straight for them. Well, not straight for them. They were probably going to Nick's office, but they'd have to pass right by their booth to get there. When Nick's eyes met Lacey's, he smiled and stopped in front of the booth. "Ladies!" He gave the table a friendly once-over before settling his gaze back on Lacey again. "It's always a pleasure to see you. I do hope you enjoy your lunch." Nick nodded, and he and Dean moved on toward the office. Lacey looked away shyly. "Who's he?" Tasha asked, practically drooling. "That is Nick Matthews. He owns this place," Deidre said. "Hire him," Camille said, still gazing at the office door long after he'd closed it. "Can't," Deidre said. "Why not?" Tasha asked. "Married." Lacey sucked in a breath and blew it back out in a long, sad sigh. "Honeymooners, remember?" "Oh, yeah." Camille turned back to look at Lacey. "What about the other one?" "His friend?" Lacey asked, pointing toward the office. "Dean?" "Yeah. He married?" "Not that I'm aware." "Ask him, then," Camille said. "Are you serious?" Lacey asked. "Yeah. The married one seems like a nice guy. His friend must be a nice guy, too." "How do you figure?" Lacey asked. "Birds of a feather," Tasha said. "What do birds and feathers have to do with it?" Lacey asked, a bit confused. "It's simple. Nice guys hang out with other nice guys." Tasha sipped her martini, then added, "So do jerks. You'll rarely find a jerk and a nice guy hanging out together." This whole marriage thing sounded a lot better when they were talking about it the other day. But today, Lacey wasn't so confident that she could actually find someone to marry her, even if it was temporary. And Nick's friend? Nick leaned against the desk in his office, folded his arms over his chest, and stared at Dean. "Beecham is taking it to the board. Everything's going to be fine." He did a one-shouldered shrug. "I'll be able to pay off what I owe the bank and my suppliers. Then it'll be a business as usual." "When are they going to let you know?" "He said a couple of days." And there wasn't a moment to spare. Nick could practically feel the panting of his suppliers breathing down his back. Chapter 14. Nick stared at the payroll account's balance on the computer screen. He might get a couple more paydays out of it if he didn't pay himself. He was surprised that the bank hadn't taken it, but then again, it was the restaurant's money, not his. Nick's eyes drifted to the date in the bottom right corner of the computer screen. It had been 3 days since he'd met with Phil Beecham. Nick had been hoping to hear back from him yesterday. Leaning back in his chair, he scrubbed his hands over his face. He had to find a solution to his current financial crisis. Neither he nor the restaurant could go on like this for much longer. Walter's foundation was his only hope, and they had to help. After all, it was the inheritance from Walter that had allowed him to start the restaurant in the first place. A gentle knock at the open door pulled Nick's eyes upward. Carrie, Hang Ten's hostess, smiled and said, "There's a Phil Beecham here to see you." Nick closed his eyes, just for a second, and uttered a silent prayer of thanks. He stood and moved out from behind the desk. "Thanks, Carrie. Let him in." Nick leaned against the front of his desk and waited for Phil and his good news. Hopefully, he had a check with him. Seconds later, Phil entered with an optimistic smile, boosting Nick's confidence. They shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, and Nick invited him to sit at one of the chairs in front of his desk. Nick took the other. "Nick, I've got great news." Phil nodded, and Nick waited eagerly to hear that great news. "The board recognizes the relationship Walter shared with your mother," Phil said. Nick wouldn't exactly call it a relationship, but no matter. He pushed the thought out of his mind just as Phil said, "And because of that, the foundation wants to help you." Yes, Nick was pleased to hear it, but he needed to know when they'd cut him a check. "The foundation is prepared to buy Hang Ten from you." Those words weren't at all what Nick had expected to come out of Phil's mouth. Nick was so floored that he hardly heard Phil as he rambled on. "We will give you fair market value. Of course, the market isn't great these days, but you'll be able to pay off your debts, tuck a little something away, and you can still run the restaurant." Phil clasped his hands together. "We will pay you a competitive salary." "You want to buy Hang Ten from me?" The notion was ringing in Nick's head like a loud bullhorn. "Yes," Phil nodded. "This is a solution where everybody wins." Nick's head was reeling, but he managed to say, "To be honest, Phil, I hadn't considered selling Hang Ten." "I completely understand," Phil said, but Nick doubted it. He couldn't possibly understand that they were asking him to give up the one thing in this world that he'd done right. He hadn't saved his brother, he couldn't save his mother, and if he didn't save Hang Ten, well then, he'd be a 3-time loser. "I'm going to have to think about this," Nick told Phil. Phil nodded. "Take a couple of days. But Nick, it is the best offer we can make, and we think the best one you're going to get." Nick gave him that much. He didn't exactly have people beating down the door to help him. No one else he could ever hope to sell the restaurant to would want to hire him to run the place. Nick stood, and Phil did the same. "I'll be in touch," Nick said, shaking his hand. He didn't want to commit to anything just yet. He knew he had little choice in the matter, but he wanted another day or two of being able to say Hang Ten was his. On the hillside terrace overlooking the Pacific, a gentle, salt-scented breeze wafted past Lacey. The house was new to her, but she loved it. She loved California. She loved freedom. "Oh, Papa, why must you meddle in other people's lives?" She let out a grumble and laid her head back on the sofa cushion. "Turns out," Camille said, sitting down on the chair to Lacey's right, "being an adult is rough." Lacey snorted. "You said it." She propped her shades up on the top of her head and looked Camille in the eye. "I really don't want to enter into an arranged marriage." "Well, no one says you have to." "I'm not going back to France any time soon either." "Not willingly, anyway." "I keep hoping that Papa will see the light." Lacey giggled, wondering how Camille would feel about her using one of Camille's favorite lines. To her delight, Camille laughed. Soon, though, she was shaking her head. "But you and I both know that's not likely." Camille sucked in a breath and shot Lacey a smile that wavered. "When it comes to you and your brothers, Maurice thinks it's his God-given right to direct your lives. And no matter how old you get, that won't change." "You seem to have put him in his place." "Not really," Camille said. "I just figured out how to appease him." She chuckled. Then her expression turned serious. "Here's the thing. You need to decide what you're going to do. If you wait until immigration approaches you, it'll be too late." "Are you telling me to go out and find a husband today?" "No," Camille shook her head. "You have a choice." "I do?" Camille nodded. "Either find a suitable man, or call your mother and tell her you're returning to France with us next week." "So, it's like that, huh?" "Pretty much." Camille stared toward the ground, closed her eyes for just a second, and then looked back up at Lacey. "Unfortunately, this is not one of those times when a person can simply choose to ignore something and it'll go away. Your father isn't going away. He's coming at you full speed ahead." "As much as I don't like to admit it," Lacey said, "I know that. I don't want it to be so, but you're right. I have to prepare." Camille shook her head. "I'm not here to talk you into doing something rash, but I promised your brother that by the time I left this country, you'd either be married or returning home to France with me. So, you see," Camille grinned, "I have to make sure you choose the right guy." Lacey laughed. "Is there a wrong one?" "Oh, yes," Camille sighed. "Tons of them. Tell me about it." But when it came to it, there was no right guy for Lacey because Mr. Right was already married. That alone should make her want to run back to France, but it didn't. And even though this would probably turn out badly, She wasn't ready to go, and she'd be damned if she'd let Papa make her.
Well, then, Lacey swallowed around the lump in her throat. Perhaps tomorrow we will start looking.
Either that, or Lacey had better start packing her bags. Chapter 15. Nick stared across the table at his and Dean's childhood friends, Ken and Jared. Getting together on Fridays for lunch was a ritual ever since graduating high school. Now that Nick owned a restaurant, that made it even easier. They never needed a reservation or had to worry about waiting for a table.
I can't believe you're going to have to sell this place, Ken said, gazing around Hang Ten's dining room.
Don't you have any sort of legal recourse? Jared asked the same question that everyone, even Nick, kept asking.
I went to the police, Nick said.
They said that because I'd made her a joint owner on the accounts, there's nothing I can do other than have a restraining order issued against her. So I did.
He'd probably get farther with a civil suit. Ken, a paralegal for a top-notch criminal attorney, shrugged and bit into his fully loaded burger.
Dean gave Ken a hardened glare.
A civil suit? Really? Is that the best you can come up with?
Ken swallowed and said, I don't make the rules.
What she's done is criminal, Jared said with a determined nod.
Regardless, Nick's stern tone got their attention. I made her joint owner on nearly all my accounts. He shrugged.
We were going to get married, for Christ's sakes.
Nick shook his head. Even now, almost 2 weeks after being dumped at the altar, he still found himself dumbfounded over how naive and gullible he'd been where Jenny was concerned.
It's my own fault.
There was nothing or no one to blame except Nick and his own stupidity.
I'm just glad I didn't add her name to Hang Ten's title yet. Otherwise she'd be taking half of this place too.
Nick glanced around, realizing he'd been gifted with a bit of luck. Small as it may be, but a little luck nonetheless.
But the fact remains that Nick needs an out, Dean said, dumping ketchup over his fries. I realize that legal or civil action may or may not prove gratifying in the end, but right now, he pointed at Nick, he needs money, and lots of it. Otherwise, we're going to have to start paying for our lunches.
Chuckles traveled around the table, infecting even Nick.
I've tried everywhere short of a loan shark, guys. Nick shook his head. I can't get a loan. Maybe what you need to do is stop thinking about getting a loan and start thinking about selling a small percentage of the restaurant to a silent partner, Ken suggested. Not a huge chunk of it, just enough to pay off the actual debts Jenny racked up for you. What about his savings? She wiped him out of well over 50 grand.
By the tone of his voice, Dean didn't like the idea of Nick just cutting his losses.
Look, if Nick wants to retain control of this restaurant, Ken said, he's going to have to chalk some of this up to lost causes.
Nick started nodding.
Yeah, I see where you're going with this. Find an investor to sell just enough of the restaurant to pay off the bank fees, the line of credit, and the suppliers. But more importantly, Hang Ten is still mine. Nick ran a quick tally in his head. 150,000 should do it. He'd have Zip to fall back on, but maybe the bank would let him keep his line of credit. Great! Nick clapped his hands together. Now, where am I going to find an investor in this economy?
All of Nick's friends' ogling eyes drifted toward the door. He glanced over his shoulder to see what they found so fascinating. Deidre pulled open the front door of Hang Ten. The cool air blowing past Lacey nearly carried away her courage. Camille and Tasha were sure that Dean was going to accept Lacey's proposal as long as he wasn't involved with someone. Yeah, right. Since when is a hot guy like Dean not involved? Lacey was already on the verge of running when she glanced around the restaurant and saw Nick, Dean, and 2 other guys she'd seen them dining with in the past. Great. Nick and all his friends were here to witness her humiliation.
Camille,
Lacey whispered as they lingered near the "Please wait to be seated" sign.
I'm thinking this is not such a great idea.
Camille looked at her with a stoic face.
So you're ready to go home? She asked. Back to France?
No, Lacey wasn't prepared for that either. She felt a groan rumble up in her throat.
Damn Papa anyway. All right. She folded her arms at her waist and stiffened. It's just not that easy. Carrie approached the group, grabbing 4 menus. Ladies, how are we today? Goods and fines came in staggering replies. Your regular booth? Carrie asked, looking at Lacey. She nodded. Carrie gestured and cut a path toward the rear of the dining room. Lacey and the others followed. Once they had settled into the booth and ordered a round of lemon drop martinis, Carrie left, and all eyes turned to the table off in the corner, filled with men. The owner of this place? Tasha inquired. What's his name? Married. Lacey cut her eyes to Tasha. His name is Married. Well, that may be, but he is delicious. She looked at Camille. Isn't he? Oh, yeah, Camille said, grinning. Now we know why Lacey and Deidre like to come here. Both women laughed. Lacey waved her hand in the air. Remember me? She asked. The sister-in-law? To both of you, I might add? Oh, good Lord, Deidre grumbled, glancing around the restaurant. There's nothing wrong with looking. Thank you, Camille and Tasha said in unison. Then Camille took it solo, saying, Guys do it all the time. Why can't we? Tasha gave Lacey one of those reproaching looks. I love your brother dearly, but I can still appreciate a nice-looking man when I see one. She smiled, and her eyes drifted back over to Nick's table. Even married ones. Speaking of married, Deidre's eyes fell over the restaurant again, looking troubled. Where is Jenny? It's not like her to not be here. She gave the guy's table another quick once-over, and then looked back at Lacey. She's always here stalking Nick. She doesn't need to stalk him anymore. She's his wife now. Lacey took a sip of her drink to get the bitter taste of the words out of her mouth. And if you don't want to head back to France pronto, Tasha said, you'd better turn into somebody's wife real quick. Lacey replied, That's easier said than done. Tasha shrugged. You just go up to the guy and say you want to make a quick, 100,000 for a few months of your time? She glanced at the table of men, then turned back to Lacey. He looks like he could put 100 grand to good use. Easier said than done. Lacey repeated her mantra, but with more tenacity this time. She knew what she had to do. She got that she was dealing with Papa, a man who never played fair. Finding a husband, even a temporary one, was her only hope. But that didn't make the task any easier. Nonsense. Tasha rolled her eyes. Lacey nearly laughed out loud and began shaking her head. Easy for Tasha to say. She wasn't the one who had to walk up to Dean and make the proposal. Want me to prove it? Tasha asked. Lacey narrowed her eyes and studied Tasha. Was she serious? Maybe Lacey should call her bluff. You going to propose for me? Lacey chuckled. Tasha elbowed Camille. Let me up. She followed Camille out of the booth, stood over the table, and said to Lacey, Watch and learn. She gave Lacey a wink before turning and heading toward the table with Nick and his friends. The booth of blondes and their lone brunette friend had been a favorable topic at the guys' table ever since they walked in. Dean didn't miss the fact that Nick's eyes were staying on the cute little blonde a little longer than usual today, the one who'd been coming into the restaurant for the last few weeks with the darker-haired girl. He took it as a good sign that Nick was showing some interest in the new woman. Maybe she could help him move on. From the corner of his eye, Dean caught sight of the bombshell of the bunch heading their way. He was surprised when she walked straight up to him, bent down, and said, Can I have a word with you? She straightened back up, looked him in the eye, and added, At the bar? He glanced at her hands, her left one in particular. She had this big honking diamond on a certain finger, probably married to some old geezer and out looking for a little afternoon delight. Sure thing, honey. He slid his chair back as he stood, puffed out his chest, and looked at the other guys, grinning. The bombshell leaned against the bar, and Dean did the same. deciding to let her take the lead. Better that she thought she was in charge. "Are you married?" she asked in a friendly enough voice. "What difference does it make?" he inquired with a smile and a measure of charm. "Are you married?" she asked again, a little firmer this time. Okay, so she was the controlling type. But he had news for her. He wasn't going for none of this weird-ass tying-up shit. Dean shook his head. "But you are." He pointed to her left hand. "Forget about me." She waved her hand between them, as if nixing that whole idea. "Are you seriously involved with anyone?" "No." Dean was answering now more for sport than anything else. She'd gotten his attention, and his curiosity was willing to let her take him wherever she wanted. "Good." She moved off the bar. "Stay here. My friend will be right with you." With that, she went back to her table, stood over it, and she and the cute little blonde, who was newly on Nick's radar, started chatting. About what, Dean couldn't hear, but he had a feeling he was about to find out. "He's not married, and he's not involved." Tasha's unbending voice delivered her words straight to the point. "Get your butt over there and talk to him. Find out if he could be the right man for the job." Her tone eased up and she giggled. "Right now?" Lacey's fear escaped with her words. "What'll I say?" "Oh, I don't know." Tasha paused, as if thinking about it. "Have you ever been arrested? You're not a serial killer, are you?" "Like he'd tell me." Lacey huffed as Deidre nudged her out of the booth. "If you're ready to go back to France," Tasha waved dramatically at the booth, "then by all means have a seat." Lacey practically stomped her way to the bar where Nick's best friend was waiting for her. She stole a glance at Nick's table. He and his other friends were watching intently. Back at the bar, Dean wore the face of curiosity. Lacey hopped up on a bar stool next to him and tried to smile, finding it oddly curious how hard that was. It wasn't every day that she asked a stranger on a date, much less to marry her. "Afternoon." His own smile changed from one of arrogance to something more along the lines of caution. "You and your friends." He glanced at the booth, then back to Lacey. "You bored? Got a bet going on?" Lacey let out a big sigh. "This was a bad idea." She prepared to jump off the stool, but Dean's gentle hand on her arm calmed her. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked in a gentle, playful way. "No." She settled back onto the stool. "But this is still a bad idea," she added, shaking her head. "You and your friend have already made me look like a fool," he said, as if the joke was on him. "Don't I at least get to know why?" Lacey hadn't considered that. She knew all about looking like an idiot, and she didn't want to knowingly put anyone else in that position. "See," she gestured toward the booth, where Deidre, Camille, and Tasha were all watching their every move. "We're all from France." Dean shook his head. "The chick who was here is an American." "Yes, but she's married to my brother." Lacey shuffled her eyes back and forth between the booth and Dean. "The one sitting beside her is married to my other brother." "I see," he said, but the look on his face suggested otherwise. "Anyway," Lacey looked around, wishing she'd brought her drink with her. "Any chance you want to make 100 grand for a few months of your time?" He looked like he wanted to say something, but couldn't. Every couple of seconds, Lacey thought a smile was going to break out on his mouth, but it never did. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, he said, "Doing what? Is it legal?" She thought about it. "Mostly." Although immigration probably wouldn't like it much. "Doing what?" "I need someone to marry me," she said. "Just for a few months, though." Dean tilted his head and stared at her like she was crazy. "Let me get this straight. You're going to pay somebody to marry you for a few months?" She nodded. "How does 100 grand sound?" 100 grand? He asked, as if it was the nuttiest thing he'd ever heard. "Okay, 250,000. She raised her hand between them. Up front, the minute you sign the marriage license. Let me guess. He gave her a hard glare. You have tons of money. Problem is you can't access it right now, but if I can come up with, say, 10 grand, you'll be able to get to it. Am I close? No. Lacey shook her head, mildly insulted by his insinuation. I can get to my money just fine. I'm talking about a business deal. 6 months of your time in exchange for $250,000. No funding on your part, no strings attached, except that to immigration the marriage must appear real. She sucked in a breath, feeling completely humiliated. 6 months, $250,000. What do you say? Who put you up to this? He asked, then looked over his shoulder and pointed at Nick. Is this your idea of a joke? Nick strolled over and asked, What's going on? Hey! Dean kept pointing at Nick, but looked at Lacey. He's the one who needs money. Marry him. What? Nick said, almost laughing. Lacey's eyes darted between the two of them and settled on Dean. He's already married. Her gaze wandered over to Nick. Aren't you? Nick hesitated, then said, No, that didn't happen. He looked a little uncomfortable, but quickly seemed to regain control of his senses. But never mind that. What are you two cooking up? Dean grabbed Lacey's hand and pulled her off the stool. Let's talk in your office, he said to Nick. Chapter 16. Nick followed Dean and the girl into his office and shut the door. He looked at her, stuck his hand out, and said, Nick Matthews, I own this joint. For now, muddled through his thoughts. Nick backhanded Dean's gut. This bozo is Dean Triplett. Lacey de Laurent, she said in her near-perfect English, but her gaze held firm with Nick's. He couldn't place her accent. Maybe a cross between French and English, if that's possible. One thing was certain, though. She looked nervous as hell. Somebody want to start from the beginning and tell me what's going on? Nick asked. It's simple, Dean said. You need money. She has money. She wants to give some to you. He looked at Lacey. 250 grand, you said, right? He waited until she nodded. Then he looked back at Nick. All you got to do is marry her for 6 months. She'll pay as soon as you say I do. What? Nick blurted. Oh, there is just one other thing, she said, with hardly any confidence at all. You'll have to live in my house for the duration of the marriage. She shrugged. Immigration and all. What? Nick said again, his voice even more strained than the first time. It's the answer to your prayers, man. Dean nodded. You can solve all your problems with 2 little words. Dean stood there looking at Nick like he'd discovered electricity or something. Nick folded his arms over his chest, cut his eyes at Dean, and said, Shut up. Just 2. Dean wiggled 2 fingers in the air. 2 little words. I'm not joking, Nick said. Say it with me. Dean nodded, then said with pronounced enunciation. I do. Dean's big mouth egging this girl on wasn't helping. Nick grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door. You need to get out, now. He shoved him out into the restaurant's dining room. Don't blow it, Dean said, just above his breath. This girl is the answer to your prayers. Or my worst nightmare. Nick took the time to close the door slowly, just to give the last few minutes time to really sink in. Once the door was shut, he had no choice but to turn around to face her. The poor girl was standing there, stunningly gorgeous and looking completely unsure about the proposal Dean had laid down between them. But there was something in her brilliant blue eyes, something vulnerable and hopeless and sad. She looked about as desperate for a husband, albeit a fake one, as Nick was for money, the real stuff. And Nick had to wonder why. Lacey looked at Nick, wondering what in God's name had happened. Where was Jenny, and why weren't they married? She wanted to ask, but couldn't find the courage. "Look, I know I'm asking a lot." Her fear shredded her words. "But I need help, and I'm willing to pay for it." "You mentioned immigration," he said. She nodded, hesitated, striving to find the right words. "My father is trying to force me to come home." "Your father can have you deported?" She nodded. "You haven't committed a crime, have you?" he asked cautiously. She sucked in a breath. "My only crime is defying Papa." "Miss de Laurent," he said, mangling her name with a decidedly American pronunciation. "You want to sit down?" He gestured toward the chairs in front of his desk. "Sure." She sat, and he did the same, right across from her. "Call me Lacey." "All right," he said, "if you'll call me Nick." She smiled, feeling the heat crawling up her neck. "Look, I understand if you want to turn me down. Your fiancé wouldn't understand at all." "Well, I don't have a fiancé anymore," he said. "And I really wish I could help you out. Lord knows you could help me." He shook his head like he was trying to convince himself of something. But of what? She wasn't sure. "We could help each other," she said hopefully. "We could?" Then he smiled, a sad sort of smile. "But I couldn't in good conscience take money from you like that." He shook his head. "It just wouldn't be right." "There's nothing dishonorable about being hired to provide a service." Even as she said it, she knew it wouldn't do a bit of good. Nick Matthews was one of those upstanding types, she could tell. He'd never use a woman, and he'd never want to be seen as having done so. Nick opened the office door and escorted Lacey out into the restaurant. He rested his hand on the small of her back, her blonde hair caressing the back of his hand as he guided her to her table, where the other women waited anxiously. He almost felt bad about turning her down, but something inside him said it wasn't right to take money from her. "I hope we'll continue to see you here at Hang Ten," he said to her with a smile. She looked at him as if she wanted to say something, make one more bid for her case, but she didn't. She didn't say anything. She just gave a smile that filled his heart with hope and looked at her friends and gave them an "it's a no-go" kind of shrug. Nick pushed himself to walk away, to let her save face. It wasn't every day that a girl as beautiful as her got turned down when 250 grand was part of the deal. He headed back to the table where only Dean remained. Ken and Jared probably had to get back to work. Nick totally understood that. "So?" Dean asked as Nick sat down. He was surprised that Dean even had to ask. "I turned her down." "Are you crazy?" "I may be crazy," Nick said, "but I'm not a cad." "You're an idiot is what you are." "I'm not taking that girl's money," Nick argued. "It wouldn't be right." "Why not? She's trying to buy a husband, and if anybody ever needed to be bought, it's you." Dean shook his head and shot Nick a frown. "This girl gave you a solution, and you threw it back in her face." "Well, it's not quite as bad as all that." Lacey and her friends filed out of the booth and headed for the door. The bombshell took the long way around so she could pass by the guy's table. She stopped long enough to place a card on the table in front of Nick. "If you change your mind?" she said, but didn't wait for a response from him. As he disappeared outside, Nick picked up the card and looked at it. It had her name and a cell phone number on it. Nick stuffed it into the glass of the unlit candle sitting in the center of the table. Dean fished it out, looked at it, and stuck it in his pocket. "Are you nuts?" Nick shook his head and laughed. "As pretty as she is, as enticing as $250,000 is, it's a bad idea." "I only have one thing to say to you." Dean's voice trailed off. When he didn't finish his statement, Nick asked, "What's that?" "How are you going to like working for somebody else?" The one thing that Dean wasn't saying, but Nick knew full well was on his mind. What was going to happen to the community center when Nick sold the Hang Ten to the foundation? Would they continue to champion Nick's cause? Nick didn't have to ask. He already knew the answer to that, which made turning down Lacey de Laurent's $250,000 proposition that much harder. Chapter 17. Dean propped his hands on the outer edge of Nick's desk, leaned in toward him, and asked, "Have you signed the papers yet?" He wore a look that bordered on terror, which was about how Nick felt. The Foundation's offer was looking less and less attractive by the minute. Who knew the very organization that had indirectly provided him with the means to build Hang Ten through his inheritance from Walter would turn around and try to steal it out from under him the minute he got into a bind that was not of his own doing. Their fair market offer, as it turned out, was anything but. He'd come out of the deal with scarcely enough cash to pay off the suppliers, the bank fees, and the line of credit. Forget about his savings. His annual salary was adequate, although not fantastic, but it was progressive, dependent upon inflation. He could, however, live in the loft above the restaurant free of charge, and the community center would receive a $3,000 a month stipend for as long as Nick worked at Hang Ten. That was less than Nick had been providing, but he was lucky to get anything for the center in the deal. In some weird way, it did help to know he could have the job for as long as he wanted, provided the restaurant turned an annual profit. But it also felt like a ball and chain. Because of the community center, he'd have a hard time moving on. But this was the price Nick was going to have to pay if he wanted Kevin's legacy to live on. And that was the important thing to Nick right now, saving the center. It was all he had left. No. Nick hadn't signed those papers. He hadn't even been able to utter a verbal agreement. He might already have lost Hang Ten, but he just couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. I haven't signed the papers. He sucked in a breath. I know I have to, but I can't keep putting it off. He let out a helpless shrug. The suppliers are going to stop making deliveries if I don't do something soon. Don't do it, Dean's expression insisted, right along with his words. Not this deal, not with the Foundation. Why not? You were only going to do it because they agreed to help the community center. Dean's shoulders slumped, and he looked away, defeated. The community center is as good as dead. Look, I know $3,000 a month is hardly enough to keep it running, but we'll find aid somewhere else. Dean shook his head. It doesn't matter. Juno Properties is selling the land the center sits on. Selling the land? Nick's heart pounded against his chest. How much? Dean said, We have 45 days to come up with $800,000. After that, it's going on the market for $1.2 million. At that moment, Nick knew what it felt like to have your world fall completely apart. $800,000. It might as well be $1.2 million because Nick couldn't come up with either. Damn it! Nick knocked that stupid fat cat Jenny had bought him off his desk. The crystal paperweight hit the floor with a loud crash and fractured into pieces. What the hell? Were all the forces in the universe lining up against him to take him down permanently? Nick leaned back in his chair and looked around the office. He sure had some shitty-ass luck. Everything in this office was going to belong, very soon, to someone else. There was no way he could take the Foundation's offer now. No point. You know what you have to do, don't you? Dean asked, still leaning across Nick's desk. Yeah, Nick nodded. I have to put Hang Ten on the market, sell her to the highest bidder, he said in a voice that was quickly losing power. After paying off my debts, maybe I'll have enough left over to start a little cafe in some obscure little town or something. No. Dean shook his head. You're going to call that chick the rich one. He looked Nick straight in the eye. You're going to accept her offer. After that, we'll figure out a way to save the community center. We've got 45 days. Chapter 18. Gerard brought a pitcher of iced tea and 4 glasses out to the terrace just outside the living room. Lacey, Deidre, Camille, and Tasha were enjoying the afternoon, watching the children.
They'd bought a little kiddie pool at a shop not far from Lacey's house, brought it home, and filled it up with about 8 inches of water. It had a slide on one side and a dragon that spewed water on the other. Juliana and James were having a grand time with their new toy. Gerard set the tray on the table and began pouring tea into the glasses. "Lois," he said of the cook he'd insisted on hiring, "asked me to inquire about dinner this evening. Will you all be dining in, or will it just be the children and the nanny again?" Dinner? The thought hadn't even crossed Lacey's mind, nor had any of the others talked about it. Her eyes traveled around the group and then back to Gerard. "Tell Lois that we'll be dining in this evening." She looked back at her guests. 6:30 sound okay? "Perfect," Camille said. "But let's feed the children a little earlier, say 5. Lacey looked back at Gerard. "There, you have it." He tipped his chin and backed away. He was so formal. Even though she was used to that sort of thing, she still found it amusing having her very own do-everything-by-the-book butler. "I really don't know why I need this guy," she said. "Or Lois, for that matter." "I think it's a good idea to have Gerard here," Camille said. "Especially once you get married. I mean, we can only assume that our judgment is good in our quest to find you a husband." She shrugged. "But when it comes down to it, it's better to be safe than sorry." Lacey hadn't thought of that. The man she married would have to live in her house for as long as the marriage lasted. It would have been so much easier if Nick Matthews or Dean Triplett had agreed to this charade. At least, she felt like she knew them, even if she didn't. Not really. But at the end of the day, she thought she would have been safe with either of them. "Point taken," Lacey said. "But how am I supposed to find someone acceptable?" She watched the children in the pool just so she wouldn't have to look Tasha or Camille in the eye. If they looked into her eyes, they might see the insecure idiot hiding behind them. "I don't want every weirdo in this state knocking on my door for $250,000. "We could always try dating sites," Tasha piped up. "That's a disaster waiting to happen," Camille laughed. "Maybe we should just try a good old-fashioned help wanted ad." Tasha nodded eagerly. Lacey's belief that this idiotic plan could work deflated. If her prospective husband was looking for a job, that meant he didn't have one. If he didn't have a job, he'd be here, all day, with her. She didn't like that idea any more than going back home with Camille and Tasha next week. "This is not going to work," Deidre said, confirming Lacey's fears. "She'd better pray otherwise," Tasha snorted. And Lacey knew, just like everybody else on the terrace, that if it didn't work, she'd be on the next flight back to France. Lacey let out a long sigh, her shoulders drooping, and dropped her head into her hand. Still cradling her forehead, she looked at the others and said, "Why can't my father just let me live my life?" None of the adults said anything for at least 10 seconds. Then all 3 of Lacey's companions burst into laughter at the same time. "So, what's it going to be?" Tasha asked. "A help-wanted ad or a dating service?" Her cell phone chimed, interrupting the groaning that was making its way up Lacey's throat. Tasha grabbed her phone off the table, checked the display, and frowned, but answered the call anyway. "Tasha de Laurent?" She said her name eloquently with her American-influenced French accent. Lacey and Deidre, and even Camille, even though she said it the same way, chuckled over Tasha's enunciation. Thankfully, de Laurent was about the only thing Camille and Tasha ever tried to sound French while saying. "Yes, it is." Seconds later, Tasha waved her hands at Lacey and pointed to the phone. Lacey gave her the one-sided shrug that oftentimes accompanied the unspoken inquiry. "What?" "Why, hell yes, she wants to talk to you," Tasha said, a little too giddy to suit Lacey. Lacey mouthed the words, "Who is that?" Tasha ignored her and said into the phone, "Can you come by the house?" She waited, listening. "Sure, that's fine. Come around 6. We're having dinner at 6:30. More listening. Then Tasha laughed.
Nonsense. We'd love to have you. Believe me, it's no intrusion.
More listening. Then Tasha snapped her fingers at Lacey, saying,
What's the address here?
Lacey rattled it off, and Tasha relayed it to the caller, then ended the call with an eager,
We'll see you about 6.
After disconnecting the call, she looked at Lacey with an oversized grin.
Who was that?
Lacey asked in a sharp tone.
That,
Tasha said, quirking an eyebrow and smiling,
was Prince Charming.
Chapter 19. Nick hadn't adequately prepared himself for what he'd walked into at this house for the ultra-rich that just so happened to be located less than a mile from Hang Ten. Dinner had been awkward. Dean would have enjoyed being the only man at a table with 4 beautiful women, but Nick couldn't seem to find his comfort zone, knowing that one of these women practically held his future in her hands. The sisters-in-law had encouraged Nick and Lacey to take their dessert on the terrace, where they could discuss the fine points of their proposed arrangement in private. As Nick stepped through the sliding glass door, he saw that the sun had not yet set, but its glare had been masked by the weeping willow and palm trees at the back of the yard. This late spring evening held an unusual chill in the air. Lacey sat down on the terrace's sofa, so Nick took the chair to her right, close enough to talk without yelling, but still far enough away that they could both avoid a crowded feeling. She drew her arms up against her sides and shivered. Nick asked,
Are you cold?
It's a little chilly,
she said. She was trying not to smile, he could tell, but even so a slight grin had begun to break on the corners of her mouth. He glanced at the fire pit, then back to her.
Would you like me to build a fire?
He asked. She looked like she was about ready to run for the hills. Nick didn't want that.
It won't take long, and I promise I won't overstay my welcome.
The smile she'd been trying so hard to restrain spread across her luscious lips.
That'd be great.
She ran her tongue over her bottom lip, and Nick about died.
And don't worry about overstaying your welcome. The person who accepts my offer will have to live here.
She looked around, and Nick tried to expel the carnal thoughts invading his head.
At least for as long as the marriage lasts.
He ignored her last statement. It was far too surreal that he was even considering this, but he had to find a way to save the community center. That'd never happen if he lost Hang Ten. Kneeling in front of the fire pit, he fished some kindling out of the box sitting at its side. After a couple of minutes, he had a fire.
So why would a beautiful girl such as yourself need to hire a husband?
He asked, nursing the fire. From the looks of this place and the fact that she was offering him $250,000 to marry her, it wasn't like she needed anyone's financial support.
It's a long story,
she said, and one I think I deserve to know if I'm going to marry you over it. He put the poker back in the box and returned to his chair. You need a green card for work or something?
Why would you think that?
Her face remained stoic. Nick couldn't tell if she was put out by that notion or if she just had no idea what a green card was.
Well, it's pretty obvious that you're not from around here.
He let out a nervous chuckle. Nick didn't need to piss this girl off. Now that he'd accepted his fate, that she was his only hope, he needed to stay in her favor.
Love the accent, by the way. Where is it, France?
It was the obvious choice, but truth be told, Nick wouldn't know a French accent from a Belgian one.
Yes,
she said.
Marseille, although I spent a lot of time at school in England.
I thought French people hated the Brits. He winked at her. Or is that Americans? He chuckled. Seriously, why are you doing this? What's got you so spooked that you think you need to get married?
My father wants me to come home.
This girl was legal, wasn't she?
How old are you, Lacey?
He'd just better go ahead and find that out right now. She looked like she was in her early 20s, but looks could be deceiving. Nick didn't need that kind of headache on top of everything else.
23,
she said. That's a relief. Nick sucked in a breath to calm his nerves.
So, what's he going to do?
Nick asked of her father.
Cut you off? But that didn't make sense. I was cutting her off going to change if she got married.
He wishes he could cut me off, Lacey laughed, and that only confused Nick more.
She must have seen it because she got serious and started talking again.
I am financially independent from my parents, so, she shrugged, Papa has to resort to drastic measures, having me deported to get me to come home. And as my mother says, she glanced at Nick and gave him a playful grin, I am my father's daughter.
And you're willing to give away $250,000 just so you can defy your father? Nick still wasn't buying it. Her offer, plainly put, sounded too good to be true. She didn't say anything for a few seconds, but held the most serious look on her face. When she finally did speak, her eyes drifted up to Nick's as she talked.
Well, I suppose that is it, in a nutshell, as my American sisters-in-law would say.
Damn. She must have a lot of money if she could easily give away $250,000 without batting an eye. Nick didn't know what had caused it, but suddenly he was intoxicated by her scheme. Maybe it was the allure of the money, the thought of clearing his debts away so he could concentrate on the community center. Or maybe it had something to do with the way the fire pit cast this faint glow over Lacey, making her beauty divinely enticing. Whether it was one or all those things combined, Nick looked at her and said,
Okay, I'm in.
He nodded.
If you'll have me.
He was agreeing, yet skepticism was still firmly rooted in his head. But I'm going to need a little more than your word that once we're married I won't end up with a check that'll bounce like a rubber ball. He chuckled to ease the sting of his words, but he was completely serious. He wanted to be able to call the bank and his suppliers tomorrow and tell them they'd have their money paid in full next week. Lacey couldn't help feeling empathy for Nick. He was a man with a bruised ego.
My attorney is drawing up a prenup that basically states you are entitled to $250,000 upon our marriage, and when we divorce, you will not be entitled to any more than the initial payment, she said. But if it makes you feel better, we can visit my bank tomorrow, where I'll have a cashier's check drawn up and made out to you, which you'll get as soon as we say I do.
He nodded. That's agreeable.
I still have a few reservations, though, she said, with a slight tinge of doubt.
Okay, he said calmly. What can I do to put you at ease?
You do understand that you'll have to live here at my house for the duration of the marriage, right?
Yes, he nodded. I get that this marriage must appear real to immigration. He paused, his brown eyes probing her with an intensity that turned her inside out. Trust me, everyone we meet will wholeheartedly believe that I tripped over you at the restaurant and got swept off my feet.
Damn, he's good.
Lacey felt herself swooning. Well, if he could do this to her, maybe he'd be able to accomplish the same thing if Papa managed to get immigration to come snooping around. Hopefully, though, it wouldn't come to that. Nick said, as if he were thinking out loud, maybe everybody will start thinking you're the reason Jenny and I didn't get married.
What happened?
Lacey couldn't stop herself from asking.
Why didn't you two get married?
Nick let out a bit of a groan, and then said, I'd really rather not talk about it. Well, she'd been waiting for the opportunity to toss his own philosophy back at him.
If I'm going to give you $250,000,
she paused and looked him square in the eye,
I think I have a right to know if there's somebody out there who can foil my plans.
Fair enough. Nick gave her a conceding nod. Even when he was annoyed, he was still strikingly handsome. Golden highlights in his chestnut brown hair glistened under the fire's glow. His matching brown eyes sparkled with a tawny hue. He was unbelievably handsome, looking like he belonged on the cover of GQ rather than sitting here in her backyard discussing an arranged and temporary marriage. What do you want to know? She wanted to know why they hadn't gotten married, but obviously he was avoiding that question. Lacey gave it time to ramble around in their heads a bit, then asked,
What if she comes back, and you are married to me?
She stuck her forefinger in her own chest.
I can't imagine that's going to go over well.
Nick shook his head. She's not coming back. There was an eerie finality in his tone. He was so sure, and she wanted to know why.
How do you know? She asked. It hasn't been that long. Give her another couple of weeks, time to really start missing you.
Lacey giggled to hide her own desire for him. She couldn't be happier that Nick and Jenny hadn't gotten married, for whatever reason. Lacey couldn't be more grateful for whatever had or hadn't passed between them that caused the wedding to be called off. But she had to remember that Nick looked heartbroken, and she guessed that he probably was. After all, he'd thought enough of Jenny to ask her to marry him. Lacey had to remember to be sensitive about that.
Trust me, Nick said. You and I, in our arranged and completely platonic marriage, we're more likely to have a child than see Jenny walk back into the picture.
Well, whatever had transpired between the two of them, at least for Nick, it appeared to be over. That was good enough for Lacey. And once she and Nick got to know one another, who knew what could happen? Chapter 20. Nick guided his truck into the driveway at Lacey's house. They'd just come from the bank, and he'd been a little more than shocked when the teller issued a cashier's check for $250,000 made out to him, Nick Matthews. The only time he'd ever seen that much money at once was when he'd gotten the inheritance from Walter. He looked at Lacey and smiled. They truly did come from different worlds. "I've got to get to the restaurant," he said. "Make sure everything's running smoothly."
"You're coming over tonight, right?"
she said in a sweet voice. They'd already discussed it, and decided it might carry more weight if he appeared to have been staying at the house every spare minute since they met, even before their whirlwind wedding tomorrow.
"Yeah,"
he nodded. "I'll bring some of my stuff over. I'll try not to be too late. The kids will probably be tired out after a day at the beach." Lacey let out a sigh.
"I hope they didn't run into any paparazzi down there. They like to roam the beaches around here, hoping to spot a celebrity or two."
She looked away shyly, as if almost embarrassed.
"And they show a keen interest in my brothers and their wives."
"But not you?" Nick found that curiously odd. She shook her head.
"My brothers used to be jet-setting playboys."
She laughed as if she were revealing some scandalous secret.
"The press has always been interested in their activities, but I'm not sure the media even knows who I am. I was the sheltered one. Being the only girl, this is my first trip to America."
She opened the door and stepped down onto the ground. "Well," Nick mused, "if they did run into any paparazzi at the beach, I'm sure Tasha gave them hell." He chuckled. That woman was a firecracker, one he would not want to tangle with.
"Yeah."
Lacey paused and took on a stern look before saying in a perfect American accent,
"She don't take no crap from nobody."
And Nick knew she was imitating Tasha. Amused, Nick shook his head and said, "I won't be late." He shifted the truck into reverse, and Lacey closed the door. He watched her amble up to the front door. The blue dress she wore showed off her slender body and long legs. Her hips swayed as she walked. Her blonde hair glistened in the sunlight. No, it wouldn't be hard to convince anybody that he'd fallen head over heels, madly in love with her. He might end up looking like a cad to some, those who would assume that Lacey was the reason he and Jenny didn't get married, but better to be thought a cad than a loser who'd been cleaned out after his fiancée dumped him. Minutes after Lacey had disappeared inside the house, Nick finally headed out. He knew he shouldn't be partaking in this scheme of hers, taking money from her like this, but she was a sweet girl, and he liked her, and she was entirely too naive. If he backed out, she wouldn't stop, and worse yet, she might run across some guy who'd do to her what Jenny had done to him. The only difference was, Nick was pretty sure that Lacey had a lot more to lose. One good thing about all this was that her house was technically within walking distance of the Hang Ten. Nick had barely had time to collect his thoughts before he rolled into the crowded parking lot and parked in his spot, the one designated no parking. The place was busy, as usual. That was good. He went inside to his office and sat down behind his desk and began tallying up numbers. A few hours later, after numerous interruptions from the staff and several phone calls, none of them from Lacey, he deduced that after paying off what he owed his suppliers, the bank fees, and the line of credit, he should have around $100,000 left. Maybe that'd be enough for the bank to take him seriously and extend a loan for the community center and its land. Nick pushed away from the keyboard and rubbed his hands over his face. He needed a drink. He got up, glancing at his watch. 4:30. He planned to head out to Lacey's around 7, so he figured he had plenty of time for the alcohol to wear off. While heading to the bar, Nick surveyed the restaurant's dining room. Jerry Parker and his mistress were at a table near the bar. Regulars. They came in once a week like clockwork. All the way up from L.A. Nick supposed it was because the likelihood of Jerry's wife showing up here wasn't good. Nick strolled over to say hello. "Parker, it's good to see you again." "Whoa!" When Jerry turned to face him, Nick was drawn instantly to the shiner taking shape around the guy's eye. "You've had a little mishap, I see," Nick said, shaking Jerry's hand and nodding to the mistress. "Some broad clocked me down at the beach," Jerry laughed, like it was no big deal. "She was a little irate that I was taking pictures of her kids." That might have come across as a little perverted, except that Jerry was a freelance photographer who made his living stalking celebrities around Southern California. "You'd better take care of that," Nick said, and walked away. His cell phone rang as he glanced over his shoulder and gave Jerry one last piece of advice. "Put a stake on it." He laughed, reaching for the phone on his belt clip. He leaned against the bar, looked at Pete, and said, "Give me a draft, would you?" Then he clicked the call on and laid his cell against his ear. "Nick Matthews." He wouldn't have known it was Lacey if not for the accent.
"Oh my God, Nick!"
The girl was frantic.
"You're never going to believe it. Tasha's been arrested."
"What?" Nick struggled to restrain the surprise in his voice.
"She caught some photographer taking pictures of the kids at the beach. She literally punched him in the face. Camille says he's going to have a black eye."
He could hear her trying to catch her breath.
"The police just showed up here and arrested Tasha. What do I do?"
Nick could hear Camille in the background, saying, "I'm going to call Julian." Must be Lacey's brother.
"Do we have to?"
Lacey asked, and Nick knew she wasn't talking to him. He looked at Jerry Parker. Nick didn't need to be a math whiz to add this up. "Tell her not to call anyone," he said to Lacey. "I'll take care of this." He ended the call and stalked back over to Jerry. Leaning down, he said calmly, "That broad from the beach is my sister-in-law." He straightened up, eyes still glued to Jerry. "What do you say you and I talk in my office?" Jerry stood, looking a little nervous. Good, Nick thought, as he led him into his office.
"Look,"
Jerry said the minute the door closed.
"I didn't know she was your sister-in-law."
A fearful look crossed his face. That meant he'd known exactly who he was photographing.
"You had her arrested?"
Nick tossed some extra anger at him, just to let him know he was serious.
"Hey man, I'm sorry."
He threw his hands up in surrender.
"I'm just trying to make a living."
"Okay, what'll the papers give you, 500, 600? Nick asked with a shrug. "I'll give you 1,000. He tallied the numbers in his head quickly. He'd been saving that money for Melina's bakery on Friday, but considering that he and Lacey were getting married tomorrow, by Friday he'd have plenty of money for Tony. "And I want the memory card, too."
"For only $1,000?"
Parker objected.
"Let me put it this way,"
Nick said with a bite.
"You wouldn't want your wife to find out about your weekly visits up this way, would you?"
"That's not even cool."
"Neither is what you're doing to my sister-in-law." "All right, $1,000, and we have a deal?"
"I want the memory card now." Nick dangled his hand between them. "And if I find out you've kept a single copy of those pictures, I'm going to call your wife." Lacey paced the length of the couch in the living room. Tasha was home now, but mad as hell and threatening to call Andre.
Nick said he'd take care of it, Lacey tried to reason with her. You were released, and all charges were dropped.
I want those damn pictures.
She was adamant, but cordial enough, Lacey knew, because Tasha was talking to her. If it had been anybody else, except maybe Camille, Tasha would have let them have it by now. Camille laid a hand on Tasha's arm.
Let's just wait and see what Nick says when he gets home.
She looked at Lacey.
He did say he'd take care of it. Let's give him a chance.
She nodded and then looked back to Tasha.
You never know.
All right. Tasha dropped onto the couch and let her fingertips tap out her anxiety on her lap. Camille shook her head at Lacey.
Tasha's simply forgotten how resourceful working-class Americans can be, she said proudly.
That's true. Tasha looked at Lacey.
We really know how to get things done.
She shook her fist and laughed.